Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly Muse, that on the secret top of Oreb, or of Sinai, didst inspire that shepherd, who first taught the chosen seed, in the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. For a long time, I've wanted to make a video about Paradise Lost by John Milton. It's a very important book to me, and I just wanted to try to put into words why it's an important book to me, why I think this book is so great. So there are a few components to Paradise Lost that are easy to identify as being special, as being unique. The first is the language. The book is written in the style of epic poetry. The language is dramatic, it's very strong, it's extremely poetic. It's the kind of language that can get stuck in your head. It's the kind of language that you like to hear out loud, that I personally love to hear read out loud. It's the kind of language which you might feel tempted to memorize. Another interesting feature of Paradise Lost is that it's a book that centers on heavy religious themes. It's a book about the creation of the world. It's a book about God. It's a book about good and evil. It's a book about Satan and the struggle, the war that exists in man or in the universe between good and evil. For people who are religiously inclined, the experience of seeing the text of the Bible or these heavy religious themes sort of brought to life, being animated by a great artist, can be a very powerful experience. A third thing that's going on in Paradise Lost that John Milton did, which was so novel and so unique, was he merged his knowledge, his erudition, his expertise of classical mythology, of the great Homeric epic poems, the pagan mythology of which he was an heir, with the religious texts of his religious tradition. So basically, he took the language and the techniques, and he often makes reference to characters and to names and to places that are central to pagan sort of Homeric mythology, and he puts that in conversation with, he contextualizes that with the Bible. And that marriage is so, on the one hand, impressive, but also so audacious and so novel and so new and unique. A fourth thing, you might say, is going on in Paradise Lost that is so cool, is the character of Satan that he creates, which is this amazingly compelling character who it's easy to feel a lot of sympathy with, but also this world that he creates. It's a world which is so big. It doesn't take place on Earth. It takes place in some sort of universe that Milton creates. We have in this world angels in heaven who fall into hell, and they're in this sort of barren, destroyed landscape. And then you have the character of Satan flying out of hell, and he flies like through the universe, and he lands on a sun, and then like on a neighboring planet, and he looks at Earth from afar. And of course, this is like way before human beings had a strong understanding of outer space, and obviously long before they ever sent anything to outer space. And so this, it's sort of like presages the science fiction genre. It's like a kind of early science fiction literature that takes place over this vast expanse, and it's a hugely creative work in that regard. The passage I was reading earlier was from the opening lines of Paradise Lost. It's from the part of the book known as the invocation of the Muse. In this invocation, he makes reference to Oreb or Sinai, which is the place in the Bible where God gives the 10 Commandments to the Israelite nation when they come out of Egypt. And from there, he immediately jumps into references to sort of pagan mythology and that genre of epic poetry. He says, "Or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God." And according to my footnotes, this is a brook of water which is haunted by the classical muses. So again, it's this melding of worlds that Milton is engaging in. He continues, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So here Milton is saying he wants to do something which has never been attempted before, and I think that history has judged that he succeeded in doing something unattempted in prose or rhyme. He continues, and chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and the pure, instruct me, for thou knowest. Thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, sat brooding on the vast abyss, and madest pregnant. I love that he says that you prefer the upright heart and pure before all temples. That more important to this spirit than religious ritual and religious ornamentation and places of worship is the upright and pure heart. And Milton continues, sort of addressing this muse, addressing the spirit. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support. That to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. And so this is an extremely audacious goal that Milton sets for himself, an extremely ambitious goal, and when we read it, we can ask ourselves, does he succeed in justifying the ways of God to men or not? And I also love what he says, and this is actually a line that sort of reverberates in my head. It gets stuck in my head from time to time. It just sort of echoes back and forth. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support. I mean, in my own life, when I think of, what prayer do I ask of God, if anything, it's to have that clarity of vision. What is dark in me, illumine. Light and dark is a central theme in this epic poem. It's a central theme in this sort of battle between good and evil that's going on. And I think part of why it's a central theme is because it's really a central theme, it's a central motif in the opening chapter of Genesis, in chapter 1. I have here Umberto Casuto on Genesis, who's a master at counting words, so he can tell us. He says, the terms light and day are found in all 7 times in the first paragraph, and there are 7 references to light in the 4th paragraph. Okay. The point being that light is this word which recurs throughout the whole first chapter of Genesis. Interestingly, there's no mention of the word sun or moon in the first chapter. And when the sun and moon are created, they're described as Hameor Hagadol and Hameor Hakatan, meaning the great light, the big light, and the small light, which is interesting, and just speaks to this theme of light and dark. In addition to the motif of light and dark that John Milton picks up on and plays with throughout Paradise Lost, I think there's a very subtle but very important allusion to something else going on here. What in me is dark, illumine. John Milton himself is blind. He's a blind poet. He's narrating this poem to his daughters. And I think it's apt, I think it makes sense that John Milton is so sensitive to this theme of light and dark because it's something which is so tragically played out in his own life. The structure of Paradise Lost, the way the story unfolds, is incredibly creative. John Milton does wonderfully amazing things with time in Paradise Lost. The book opens with fallen angels who have been vanquished, thrown out of heaven, and they sort of regroup in hell, and they have to make a plan of how to respond to this loss that they've just suffered at the hands of God. And Satan comes up with this idea that he'll go travel through space and find God's creation on earth, and he will attempt to cause them to sin as a way of sort of taking revenge on God. And then we, later in the poem, learn about the whole backstory of the war between heaven, between the fallen angels and heaven, in the form of a flashback. There are 12 books in Paradise Lost. And for a long time, what's been one of the most exciting sections and powerful sections for me personally in Paradise Lost is from Book 3. In the opening of Book 3 of Paradise Lost, we get a total break in the narrative, a total shift in perspective, a shift in narration. Instead of being presented with John Milton's characters and with the character of Satan and the story that's going on, suddenly we get this intrusion of the author. Suddenly John Milton addresses himself to us and talks about himself. And he writes in this section, this beginning of Book 3, about his blindness. Book 3 opens, "Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven's firstborn." The word hail is an important word in this book. I think not long before this we had the famous quote by Satan of "Hail horrors," where he asserts his evil, the evil that he is going to now embrace, and the horror that is now he's going to lean into, so to speak, in his own life. But this is the antithesis of that. Milton says, "Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven's firstborn, or of the eternal coeternal beam, may I express thee unblam'd, since God is light, and never but an unapproached light dwelt from eternity, dwelt then in thee, bright effluence of bright essence increate." So all this is just really beautiful poetic language about the purity of light and the analogy between God and light. Skipping a bit. "Before the sun, before the heavens thou wert." This is a reference to the fact that in the creation story of Genesis, God creates light before he creates the heavens, before he creates the sun and the moon. "And at the voice of God, as with a mantle, didst invest the rising world of waters dark and deep, one from the void and formless infinite." Milton says, "Thee I revisit now with bolder wing." Milton saying, I revisit light now with bolder wing. "Escaped from the Stygian Pool, though long detained in that obscure sojourn, while in my flight through utter and through middle darkness, borne with other notes then to the Orphean Lyre, I sung of chaos and eternal night." He's playing with these colors, with this light and dark theme. He said, up until now we've been in hell, and I've been describing chaos and night, and now I'm going to talk about light. Again, just notice the way he plays with this contrast, with this juxtaposition. He continues, "Taught by the heavenly Muse to venture down the dark descent and up to reascend through, though hard and rare, thee I revisit safe." And this is where the poem gets extremely personal and extremely sad. "Thee I revisit safe, and feel thy sovereign vital lamp, but thou revisit'st not these eyes, that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray, and find no dawn. So thick a drop serene hath quenched their orbs, or dim suffusion veiled. Yet not the more seaside do wander where the Muses haunt, clear spring or shady grove or sunny hill, smit with the love of sacred song, but chief thee Sion, and the flowery brooks beneath, that wash thy hallowed feet and warbling flow. Nightly I visit, nor sometimes forget those other two equalled with me in fate, so were I equalled with them in renown." So what Milton is saying here is he often thinks about, nightly he thinks about these two other characters who are also blind. Blind Thamyris and blind Maeonides. And Tiresias and Phineus, prophets old. Tiresias is the blind sage of Thebes. Maeonides is Homer. And so these are characters from mythology, from the Homeric world of epic poetry, who are also blind. And Milton says that he thinks of these characters. Skipping a bit. "Thus with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of evening or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine." Milton just gives a list of the things that he'll never be able to see again. but cloud instead, and ever during dark surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair, presented with a universal blank of nature's works to me expunged and raised, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. But now Milton does something really interesting, and what I think is sort of courageous. And he tries to see how in this condition that he's in, this tragic condition that he's in, if he can find its own kind of richness, its own kind of depth, which is uniquely available to him in this state. He says, "So much the rather, thou celestial light, shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate. There plant eyes, all mists from thence purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight." Milton's prayer is that despite his blindness, he be granted a kind of internal sight, a kind of internal clarity. The story of Paradise Lost is a lot of things. It's an epic story about the creation of the world, about our first ancestors as told in the Bible, the story about a war between good and evil, the forces of good and evil, light and darkness. But a central part of the story, and I think a part of the story that Milton really focuses on and is really masterful at communicating, is the sense of the tragedy, of the tragic, the sense of loss, where Adam and Eve were put into Eden, into a kind of paradise, a perfect state, and they lost it. There's something so tragic in that loss. But the book is also about sort of a prayer, a hope, that in this fallen state, in this post-lapsarian state, thrown out of Eden, there might be a new kind of richness and a new kind of depth available that wasn't there before. And I think Milton captures that in his poem.